The moment Effie Lockhart walked through the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, every head in the room turned, and not a single man among them could have predicted that, before the night was finished, one of their own would be flat on his back before the fiddle player drew his bow across the first string. Dusty Creek sat at the crossroads of two cattle trails in the hill country of central Texas, the kind of town that had grown up fast and rough around a single water source and a railroad depot that the Great Texas and Pacific Railway had promised to extend southward. The promise had never quite materialized into rail spikes and timber, but the people who had come for it had stayed anyway, building their lives out of red limestone and cedar and stubborn determination. There were merchants and blacksmiths and schoolteachers and ranchers, and there were cowboys, plenty of them, men who rode for the big outfits and drifted into town on Saturday evenings smelling of cattle and sweat, and wanting something warm and bright to look at for a few hours before the week swallowed them again. The Silver Spur was the brightest thing Dusty Creek had to offer on a Saturday night. Old Pete Garland had built it with timber hauled down from the hill country cedar breaks, and his wife, Ruby, had decorated the interior with red curtains she had ordered from a catalog out of St. Louis. There was a long bar of polished oak, a piano that was mostly in tune, and a small square of open floor near the far wall where people danced on the good weeks, when someone remembered to bring the fiddle. Effie Lockhart was 24 years old and had been in Dusty Creek for exactly 8 months, having arrived from Charleston, South Carolina, in the late summer of 1881 to take the position of schoolteacher that the town had been advertising for 2 years without success. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher herself, a woman who had raised Effie alone after her father had gone to fight in the war between the states and had not come back, and Effie carried in her the particular combination of steel and softness that comes from being raised by a woman who has already buried her grief and decided to keep living anyway. She was slender and dark-haired, with green eyes that observed the world with a sharpness that some people mistook for severity until she smiled, and then there was no mistaking her for anything but warm. She had come to Dusty Creek with 2 trunks of books and a box of her mother's good china, and absolutely no idea what the Texas Hill Country was going to ask of her. 8 months in, she had a fair notion. She had learned which children came to school hungry and made sure there was something in the drawer of her desk for them. She had learned which fathers drank and which mothers worked themselves into the ground, and she had learned that the particular loneliness of the frontier had a sound to it, a low wind through the cedar, a silence at night that was broader than any silence she had known in Charleston. She had also learned that the Saturday evening dances at the Silver Spur were the one occasion on which the entire town exhaled at once, set down whatever burden they were carrying, and remembered that they were human beings who wanted to be happy. That was why she was there tonight, in a dress of dark blue cotton that she had pressed carefully that afternoon, her dark hair pinned up with 2 of her mother's tortoiseshell combs, walking through the swinging doors of the Silver Spur into the lamplight and the noise and the smell of whiskey and sawdust and boot leather. Her friend and neighbor, Clara Hutchins, was already at a table near the wall. Clara was the wife of the town's pharmacist, a practical woman of 30 who had befriended Effie with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who simply saw a person in need of a friend and decided to be one. She waved Effie over and pushed out a chair. "You are late," Clara said, not unkindly. "I was finishing a letter to my mother," Effie said, settling into the chair and looking around the room. It was already crowded, the bar 3 deep with cowboys and townsmen, the air thick with the sound of conversation and the clink of glasses. Pete Garland was pulling bottles off the shelf behind the bar with the efficient choreography of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Ruby Garland moved between tables with a tray, her red hair braided over one shoulder. The fiddle player had not yet arrived. There was a man at the piano picking out a tune with one finger, but the dancing floor was empty. "Who is playing tonight?" Effie asked. "Old Silas Reeves, they say," Clara told her. "And two of the hands from the Rocking M are supposed to bring their guitars. Should be a proper evening." Effie nodded and accepted the glass of lemonade that Ruby set in front of her without being asked, because Ruby always remembered that the schoolteacher did not drink whiskey. She was looking around the room with the particular attentiveness of someone who is genuinely interested in people, cataloging the faces, noticing who had come in together and who sat alone when she saw him. He was sitting at the bar with his hat still on, which in Dusty Creek was not unusual for a cowboy in the Silver Spur, but he had turned slightly on his stool so that his back was not entirely to the room. He was tall, even sitting, with the lean, hard-used look of a man who spent his days in the saddle. He was wearing a dark canvas jacket over a blue work shirt, and his hat was the kind that had been shaped by years of use into something entirely personal, battered at the brim and honest-looking. He was perhaps 30, or close to it, with a jaw that was square and a face that was weathered and somewhat serious, and he was holding his glass of whiskey with both hands loosely, the way a man holds something when he is not really interested in drinking it but needed something to do with his hands. Effie did not realize she had been looking at him for longer than was polite until Clara said, in a tone that was carefully neutral, "That is Martin Monroe. Rides for the Rocking M." Effie looked away. "I was not staring." "You were," Clara said pleasantly, "and so has every other woman in this room since he came in an hour ago. The man has a face that earns looking at." "Clara." "I am simply making an observation," Clara said, and lifted her own glass. Effie arranged her expression into something more composed and focused on the far side of the room, where old Silas Reeves had finally come through the door carrying his fiddle case, and behind him, two young cowboys with guitars, both of them grinning with the uncomplicated pleasure of young men who knew they were about to be popular. Martin Monroe had, in fact, been in Dusty Creek for 3 weeks. He had ridden up from the Rocking M's winter range down in Uvalde County, a big spread owned by a man named Caldwell, to handle some business with the ranch's summer operation near Dusty Creek's water sources. It was not unusual for Caldwell to send his best hand up ahead of the main drive, and Martin was, without much argument, the best hand Caldwell had. He was 31 years old and had been working cattle since he was 16, first in Louisiana where he was born, then drifting west through Mississippi and into Texas, picking up wages and skills in equal measure, and depositing very little of either anywhere in particular. He was a man who had not put down roots because the opportunity had not arisen, or perhaps because he had not quite been ready to look for it. He was not the kind of man who examined his own motivations with great thoroughness. He rode, he worked, he ate when there was food and slept when there was dark, and on the rare occasions when someone invited him to do something like attend a dance, he came along mostly because refusing felt rude and staying at camp alone felt worse. Tonight one of the Rocking M hands, a cheerful 18-year-old named Billy Prout, had told him in no uncertain terms that he was coming to the Silver Spur or Billy would take it personally. Martin had come. He had no intention of dancing. He had never danced a single step in his life and saw no reason to begin now. He would drink one whiskey, which he had been doing for the past hour with great efficiency of pace, nod at whatever the conversation required, and leave at a reasonable hour. That was the plan. The fiddle started. Silas Reeves drew his bow across the strings with the authority of a man who had been playing since before most of the people in the room were born, and the note that came out was true and bright, and it cut through the conversation the way a bell cuts through distance. The two guitar players came in behind him, and the music opened up into something warm and rollicking, a reel that Effie recognized from the dances her mother had taken her to as a girl back in Charleston, different in flavor but the same in spirit. People moved toward the dance floor. Billy Prout materialized at Martin's elbow. "Come on," Billy said. "No," Martin said. "You cannot just sit on this stool all night. I have been managing it fine for an hour." "Martin." Billy's voice held the aggrieved sincerity of youth. "There are ladies present. It is not dignified to just sit there like a fence post." "I am perfectly dignified," Martin said, and turned back to his whiskey. Billy made a sound of deep frustration and disappeared into the crowd, no doubt to find a partner who had more sense. Martin watched the dancers. He watched the way people moved together, the easy partnership of hands and steps, the way women laughed when their partners spun them too fast, the way the older married couples moved with the unconscious synchronization of long practice. It was something, he admitted to himself, something he could not name. He watched it the way he watched things he did not understand, with a quality of attention that was more honest than he would have admitted out loud. He did not watch any one person in particular. He told himself that. Effie had declined the first two requests to dance, not from disinterest, but because Clara had pulled her into a detailed account of the ongoing feud between Mrs. Abernathy and the dressmaker on Main Street. And by the time the account was finished, the music had shifted into a slower piece, and the dance floor had reconfigured itself around the couples who preferred that tempo. She was thinking about getting up and finding someone to dance with because she genuinely loved dancing and had missed it badly in the months since arriving in Dusty Creek, where social evenings were rarer than she had been accustomed to, when something happened at the bar. It was not dramatic, in the way that dramatic things in novels tend to be. It was simple and almost absurd. Young Billy Prout, who had evidently taken it into his head to drag his reluctant companion to the dance floor through sheer force of enthusiasm, grabbed Martin Monroe by the arm and gave a tremendous pull at the exact moment that the sawdust on the barroom floor, worn smooth by the evening's traffic, offered no purchase whatsoever to the heels of Martin's boots. Martin came off the stool. His boots found nothing under them. He went sideways and then downward with the swift and complete commitment of a man who has simply run out of floor, and he landed flat on his back in the sawdust before the first song had properly ended, before Silas Reeves had played more than 2 minutes of music, and the entire Silver Spur saloon went briefly, collectively silent. Then about 15 people laughed. Martin Monroe lay on the floor of the Silver Spur saloon and stared at the ceiling, which was cedar planking with 2 oil lamps hanging from hooks, and he breathed for a moment with the deliberate concentration of a man taking a personal inventory. Nothing hurt except his pride, which was hurting considerably. He heard the laughter and understood it and could not entirely fault it, because he would have laughed too had it been someone else. He began to push himself up, and then a hand appeared in his field of vision, a slender hand with ink-stained fingers, extended downward with the straightforward practicality of someone who saw a person on the floor and thought they should probably be helped up. He took the hand. He looked up as he rose and found himself looking at a woman with green eyes and dark hair and a dark blue dress, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not laughing, exactly, though there was something in the corners of her mouth that was trying to be. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, and realized he was still holding her hand and let it go. "Billy Prout," she said, looking past him to where Billy was standing with both hands over his mouth, apparently torn between mortification and amusement, "you ought to be ashamed of yourself." "Yes, ma'am," Billy said, and sounded like he meant it. Effie looked back at Martin. There was sawdust on his jacket and his hat had rolled several feet away, and he looked, she thought, like a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere else, possibly somewhere with a different floor. He had dark eyes, she noticed, nearly black, and they were looking at her with an expression that was very hard to read but very direct. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. "I am Effie Lockhart. I teach the school on Cedar Street." "Martin Monroe," he said. "I ride for the Rocking M." There was a beat of silence between them, the particular silence of 2 people who have been introduced in slightly undignified circumstances and are both deciding how to proceed. "Well," Effie said, and she let the smile that had been trying to happen actually happen, and it changed her face entirely. "I imagine you would like your hat." He retrieved his hat. He brushed the sawdust from his jacket. He was aware that the saloon had resumed its noise around him, and that the music had picked back up, and that various people who had witnessed his ungraceful descent had found other things to look at, as people in small towns do when they have collectively decided to be polite. He was also aware that Effie Lockhart had returned to her table and was saying something to the woman sitting there, and that the woman was looking at him with undisguised curiosity. He stood at the bar for a moment with his hat in his hands, which was not something he usually did, and then he did something he also did not usually do. He walked across the room to the table where Effie Lockhart was sitting, and when she looked up at him he said, with the care of a man picking his words because he knew the ones available to him were insufficient, "Miss Lockhart, I wonder if you would like to dance." Effie looked at him for a moment. "I thought you did not dance," she said, "given the evidence." "I have never danced a single step in my life," he said, and the honesty of it surprised even him. "But I think I would like to try." Clara Hutchins made a sound that she converted with some effort into a cough. Effie stood up. They walked to the dance floor together, and Martin Monroe stood at the edge of it for just a moment looking at it the way a man looks at a river he is about to ford when he is not sure of the depth, and then Effie said, "Give me your hand," and he did. She put his right hand at her waist and held his left hand in hers and said, "Watch my feet first. It is a waltz. 3 counts. 1, 2, 3. The steps go forward, side together. Forward, side together." He watched her feet for exactly 4 measures, which was enough. He had always been good at watching how things were done and then doing them. It was part of what made him a good hand with cattle and horses, this ability to observe and then translate observation into action. The steps were not complicated. The music was patient and the fiddle was steady. They began to move. He was not graceful. He was careful, which was something else, but the carefulness had a quality to it that Effie found she did not mind at all. His hand at her waist was steady, and he held her at the proper distance, and he watched where they were going with the focused attention of a man who has decided that if he is going to do something, he is going to do it correctly. "You are doing well," she told him. "Do not patronize me," he said, but there was no edge to it. "I am not," she said. "You are actually doing well, for a man who was on the floor 3 minutes ago." He looked at her then, at her green eyes and the slight color in her cheeks from the warmth of the room, and something shifted in his chest that he did not have a name for. "I suppose I had a good reason to get up," he said. Effie looked at him carefully, and Martin Monroe, who was not in the habit of saying anything that could be called romantic, felt the back of his neck go warm and was grateful for the dim lighting. They danced through the end of that waltz and partway into the next piece, before Effie suggested they stop before his luck ran out again. And he laughed, which surprised him because he could not remember the last time something had made him actually laugh rather than just acknowledge the presence of humor. They went to the bar, because Effie's table had been taken over by a group of ranch wives and there was no room, and Martin ordered a second whiskey and Effie asked Pete Garland for more lemonade, and they stood together at the bar in the way that people stand together when they are not yet comfortable but are wanting to be. "How long have you been in Dusty Creek?" Martin asked. 8 months, she said. "I came from Charleston, South Carolina." "Yes, you know it. I know of it," he said. "I am from Louisiana originally, Baton Rouge." "How long since you have been back?" He considered. 14 years. She looked at him in a way that acknowledged something without requiring him to explain it. "And you have been riding since then, more or less. Do you like it?" She asked it genuinely, as she asked everything with actual interest. He turned the glass in his hands. "It suits me," he said. "Or it has." She noticed the past tense and decided not to pursue it. The evening was not the time for things that required too much careful handling. Instead, she asked him about the rocking M and the cattle and the country between here and Uvalde, and he talked about it with the ease of someone speaking about what they know best, and she listened with the ease of someone who is genuinely interested in the world. By the time the Silver Spur began to thin out toward midnight, they had been standing at that bar for 2 hours, and the conversation had ranged over things that had nothing to do with cattle, including her mother's bookshelf and his early memory of the Mississippi River and the particular quality of the light on the Texas hill country in the evening, which they had each, it turned out, noticed independently and found remarkable. Clara Hutchins had come to say good night an hour earlier and had given Effie a look of such cheerful significance that Effie had been forced to look at the ceiling until Clara left. When Pete Garland began stacking chairs and Ruby started blowing out the extra lamps, Effie set down her glass and said, "I should go. The children will be in school at 8 and they are merciless about a teacher who is tired." "I will walk you," Martin said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same directness he had shown from the beginning, nothing performed or elaborate about it, just a man saying what he meant. "All right," she said. The night outside was cool and clear. The Texas hill country sky spread above them with the particular extravagance it reserves for moonless nights, a blanket of stars so dense and bright that Effie always felt slightly overwhelmed by it, having grown up under the more modest sky of the Carolina coast. She said as much, and Martin looked up at it for a moment with the unself-conscious openness of a man who had slept outside under it for 14 years. "You get used to it," he said. "I do not think I want to," she said. He looked at her then, and she was looking up at the sky, and the starlight was enough that he could see the line of her profile and the thoughtful set of her mouth, and he thought, with a clarity that was unusual for him, that he had never met anyone quite like her. They walked the 2 blocks to her small house on Cedar Street, which she rented from the widow Maddox, and at the gate he stopped and she stopped. "Thank you for helping me off the floor," he said. "Thank you for asking me to dance," she said. "Even though neither of us was quite sure how it would go, I am sorry I stepped on your foot." "Only twice," she said, and smiled. He stood there with his hat in his hands again, which he noticed and was annoyed by, and said, "I wonder, Miss Lockhart, if you would object to my calling on you." Effie Lockhart, who had been wondering throughout the walk home whether he would ask, said, "I would not object to that at all, Mr. Monroe." He put his hat back on, which seemed to settle him. "Sunday afternoon, then, if that suits." "Sunday afternoon suits," she said, and went inside. Martin walked back through the quiet streets of Dusty Creek toward the bunkhouse at the Rocking M's Town Corral where he was staying, and the night around him was the same night it had been 3 hours ago, the same stars and the same cedar smell and the same silence, and yet everything felt slightly different, the way a room feels different after the windows have been opened. He did not examine this feeling with any great precision. He simply noted it and carried it with him into sleep. He came Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, which was precisely when he had said he would come, and Effie met him at the gate with her hat on because it was a fine afternoon and she had thought they might walk. They walked out past the edge of town to where the cedar gives way to the open limestone ridges, and they talked the whole way there and back, and it was easy, the way some conversations are easy from the very first moment, as though the 2 people involved had some prior agreement about honesty. He told her about the Rocking M and about Caldwell, who was a fair employer if not a warm one, and about the work of the spring roundup that would begin in a few weeks when the main drive came up from Uvalde. She told him about the school and about the 8 families she was most worried about, the ones where she could see the poverty grinding at the edges, and about the girl named Pearl Davenport who was 11 years old and the best reader Effie had ever taught, and who Effie was determined to see get more education than Dusty Creek could offer. He listened to all of it. She noticed that he listened the way he had danced, with complete and careful attention. "What will you do when the drive is over?" She asked him as they came back into town, the afternoon light going golden across the limestone storefronts. "Ride back down with the herd," he said. "Spend the fall and winter on the winter range." He paused. "That is the usual run of it. Is that what you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. They had reached her gate and he opened it for her and she went through and turned to look at him over it. "I am starting to wonder about that," he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could tell, this man who was careful with his words. She thought about that for a long time after he tipped his hat and left. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of time that is moving fast and slow at once, each day its own complete thing, and also part of something larger that was gathering itself. Martin came every Sunday without fail, and on 2 of the Thursday evenings in between he appeared at her gate with no particular excuse offered except that he had been in town on ranch business and had found himself walking in her direction. And Effie, who appreciated directness, appreciated this form of it very much. He brought her things, not extravagant things. A man of his means could not afford extravagance, but things that showed he had been paying attention. A handful of late wildflowers he had found on the ridge above town, a piece of limestone with a fossil in it, a small spiral shell pressed into the gray rock that he had turned up with his boot heel while checking fences, a book of poetry by Walt Whitman that he had found at the dry goods store, which carried a small selection of reading material, and which he gave her with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who was not sure a cowboy giving a schoolteacher a book of poetry was appropriate, but had decided it was what he wanted to do. She had read it 3 times by the next Thursday. The main rocking herd came up from Uvalde in late April, several hundred head of longhorns moving through the cedar and up onto the grassy flats north of Dusty Creek, and for 10 days Martin worked the kind of hours that left no room for anything except cattle and sleep, up before dawn and in the saddle until dark, and Effie did not see him. She noticed this absence with a specificity that told her something important about the state of her own feelings, the way you notice the absence of a sound you had not consciously realized you had come to rely on. On the 11th day, he appeared at her gate in the early evening, looking like a man who had been sleeping outdoors for a week and a half, which he had, and she brought him onto the porch and gave him coffee and a piece of the apple cake she had made the day before, and he ate and drank and did not say much for a while, and she did not require him to. She graded papers at the small table on the porch while he sat in the other chair and recovered himself, and the easy quiet between them was, she thought, one of the most comfortable things she had experienced in a long time. "I missed this," he said finally. She looked up from the papers. "The apple cake." "This," he said, and the gesture he made was slight but encompassing, the porch and the evening and the table between them and her, and she felt the word land in her chest. "I missed it too," she said, and went back to grading, but her pen was not moving very fast. In early May, something happened that unsettled the comfortable rhythm they had built. It was not dramatic, but it was significant. A man named Harlan Booth arrived in Dusty Creek. Booth was a land agent, the kind that had been moving through the hill country in those years, acquiring deeds from ranchers who were cash poor and pressuring families who had come to the end of their resources. He set up in the hotel on Main Street and began making calls, and within 2 weeks he had made it known that he was interested in several parcels, including the land on which the widow Maddox had her house and rental property, which was to say the house where Effie lived. Effie found out about this from Clara, who heard it from her husband, who had heard it from the widow Maddox herself, who was 71 years old and frightened and very nearly out of money since her husband had died 3 years prior. Effie did not panic. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had not raised a panicker. But she was worried, and she was angry in the measured way of someone who recognizes injustice clearly and refuses to pretend otherwise. The widow Maddox deserved to stay in her home, and so did Effie, though her own situation was the lesser concern. What mattered was that Booth was using the widow's desperation to acquire property at far below its worth, and that this was what land agents did in 1882, and that there was very little standing between the widow and a very difficult situation. She mentioned this to Martin on Thursday evening, laying it out plainly, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, his dark eyes steady on her face. "What does she need?" he asked when she had finished. "Money," Effie said. Enough to clear the small debt she has with the bank. It is not an impossible amount, but it is more than she has and more than I have. If she could clear that debt, the bank would leave her alone and Booth would have no leverage." Martin was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he asked. She told him the figure. He absorbed it. "That is about what 2 months of my wages come to," he said, and she heard in his voice that he was not saying this as a complaint but as a calculation. "Martin," she said carefully, "I was not telling you this so that you would—" "I know you were not," he said. "That is not the reason I am thinking about it." He did not say anything more that evening, but the following Monday he came to her school at the end of the day, which he had not done before, and waited outside in the afternoon light while the last of the children filed out past him, some of them looking at him with the frank curiosity of children. And when Effie came to the door and saw him, she felt something warm move through her. "I talked to Caldwell," he said. "Martin, I asked him to advance me 2 months of wages," he said. "Against the work I have already done and the work that is committed." He agreed. He held out an envelope. "This is for the widow Maddox's debt. I would appreciate it if you managed the delivery of it so that she does not feel any burden about it." Effie looked at the envelope and then at him, and she felt the kind of emotion that does not want to come out as words right away, the kind that sits in the throat and requires a moment. "This is a great deal of your money," she said. "It is the right use of it," he said. She took the envelope. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him and said, "I am going to need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I think very highly of you, Martin Monroe," she said. "I think very highly of you indeed, and I want you to know that." He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes of his and said, "I think the same of you, Effie Lockhart, in case there was any question." There was no question. Effie delivered the envelope to the widow Maddox the next morning, explaining that an anonymous benefactor wished to see her situation resolved, and the widow, who was a sharp woman beneath her distress, looked at Effie for a long moment and said, "You have a good man looking out for you, child," and Effie did not correct the implication. Harlan Booth departed Dusty Creek 2 weeks later, having found his leverages insufficient. He took his ambitions to the next county and left the town to its own concerns, which were quite sufficient without his assistance. The spring moved on. The cattle drive completed its northern leg, and the Rocking M herd was settled on the summer range north of town, which meant that the rhythm of Martin's work changed, became more predictable, and the Sundays and Thursdays became a fixture that everyone in Dusty Creek took note of, as small towns do, with the interested attention of a community that has decided it has an opinion. Clara Hutchins told Effie cheerfully that the entire town expected a proposal before summer's end. Effie told Clara that the entire town could mind its business. Clara said the two things were not mutually exclusive. She was not wrong. What Effie had not told Clara, and what she was working through by herself in the quiet of her evenings after school, was that her feelings for Martin had become something considerably more serious than she had entirely planned for. She had come to Texas to teach school, to be independent, to make something of herself on her own terms, and she had not expected to fall in love with a cowboy who had landed on the floor of the Silver Spur Saloon on a Saturday night in spring. Love in the abstract was something she believed in and had hoped for. Love in the specific, this love with this particular man, was something she was still learning how to hold, learning how much space it took up and what it required of her. What it required, she was discovering, was very little pretending and a great deal of honesty, which happened to be the things she was best at. On the second Sunday of June, Martin arrived at her gate in the afternoon, and instead of their usual walk he asked if she would come with him because he wanted to show her something. He had 2 horses from the Rocking M's remuda, his own bay gelding and a gentle roan mare he had borrowed for her, and they rode out of town to the east, following a cattle track up through cedar breaks and across limestone ridges until they came to a place where the ridge dropped away and the view opened across the whole of the hill country to the south and west, blue and green and hazy in the summer afternoon, the sky enormous and pale above it. He had been there before. She could tell. He knew exactly where to go. He dismounted and she dismounted, and they stood at the edge of the ridge and looked at it for a while without speaking. "I come here when I need to think," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the country, his hat in his hands, and the afternoon light was on his face, and she thought about how much she had come to love that face, its seriousness and its honesty, and the way it changed when something genuinely amused him. "What do you think about up here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned lazy circles below them over the cedar. "Lately," he said. "You." Effie looked at the country below them. "Martin," she said. "I am not a man who has a great deal to offer," he said, and she recognized by his voice that he had been building toward this for some time and was determined to get through it. "I have my wages and my horse and my saddle. I have not got land or a house or anything that a woman has a right to expect. I have been thinking about what I can offer, and it is limited in terms that matter. But I want to say to you plainly that I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I did not know I was capable of it, to be truthful, and that is not something I say to flatter you. It is simply a fact that I am still getting used to." He stopped. The hawk completed another circuit below them. "What are you asking me?" Effie said quietly. He turned to look at her then, and whatever it cost him to be this unguarded, he was paying it without flinching. "I am asking if you would be willing to make a life with me," he said. "I cannot tell you exactly what that life would look like because I do not know yet, but I know that I want to make it with you, and I want to know if you want the same." Effie Lockhart had been turning words over in her head for weeks, the right words for this moment, the ones that would say exactly what was true without overstating or understating, because she was, at her core, a woman who cared about saying the right thing. She had a whole speech prepared. She had considered different versions of it. She said, "Yes, Martin, I want exactly that." He looked at her for a moment as if making sure he had heard correctly, and then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a kind of opening, as if something that had been held very carefully for a very long time had been set down. He stepped toward her and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. And then he kissed her, gently, carefully, the way he had danced that first night, with concentrated attention and absolute intention. And Effie closed her eyes and felt the hawk-wide sky above her and the limestone ridge under her feet and the warmth of his hands, and thought that this was the truest thing that had happened to her in a long time. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with the same expression, and she laughed a little, because she could not help it, and he laughed too, the real laugh she had been lucky enough to hear before, and below them the hawk caught a thermal and rose. They needed to work through the practical matters, which were considerable. Martin went to Caldwell the following week and had a conversation that he reported to Effie in full on Thursday evening, sitting on her porch with coffee. Caldwell had been the kind of employer Martin had described, fair without being warm, and he had received the news that his best hand intended to marry and settle in the Dusty Creek area, with the resigned practicality of a man who has learned that the best hands always eventually want something the range cannot give them. He had offered Martin the position of foreman for the Rocking M's summer operation in the hill country, which was a permanent position in the sense that the summer range was now a fixed part of the Rocking M's operation. It came with a wage considerably better than what Martin had been making as a hand, and it came with a small house on the summer range property, a stone house that one of the previous owners had built and that had been sitting empty. "It is not much of a house," Martin told her honestly. "It needs work. The roof on the west end is questionable and the floor needs replacing in the main room, but it is solid stone and it is on a good piece of ground." Effie thought about this. "How far from town?" she asked. 4 miles, he said. "The road is passable year-round. She could ride to school. She could continue to teach. These were not things that needed to be given up." "Show me the house," she said. He took her to see it the following Sunday, and she walked through it with the careful attention she gave to everything, assessing what was there and what was needed. It was small, 3 rooms, the main room with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a lean-to at the back that could serve as a kitchen if it were properly fitted out. The west end of the roof was indeed questionable. The floor in the main room was warped in two places. The fireplace was solid limestone and beautifully built, and the windows faced east and south, and the light came in clean and good. And outside the south window there was a live oak tree of considerable age and beauty that spread its arms over the whole side of the house. "It has good bones," she said, standing in the middle of the main room. Martin, who had been watching her with the slightly tense attention of a man who is waiting for a verdict, let out a breath. "It does," he said. "The roof needs addressing before winter," she said, "and I want new boards in this floor. The rest we can do over time." "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. "I will need bookshelves." "I will build them," he said. She smiled. He crossed the room and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, looking at the south window and the oak tree and the good light, and thought about books on new shelves and morning coffee in this room and the particular pleasure of building something with someone you chose. They were married in September of 1882 in the small Methodist church on the west end of Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the air had the first cool edge of autumn in it, and the cedar was sharp and clean. Clara Hutchins stood with Effie, and Billy Prout, who was luminously pleased with himself for having been at the origin of the whole thing, stood with Martin, though this was a fact they had to explain to Billy in some detail before he fully understood why his contribution was being acknowledged. The minister was a broad, cheerful man named Reverend Holloway, who had married half the couples in Dusty Creek, and baptized most of their children, and conducted the funerals of those who did not survive the hard years. And he performed the ceremony with the practiced warmth of someone who believed in what he was doing. Effie wore her blue dress, the dark blue cotton one, pressed within an inch of its life in her mother's tortoiseshell combs, and when Martin saw her come through the church door on the arm of old Pete Garland, who had offered the service in the absence of her father, he stood very straight and still, and Clara Hutchins, standing to his left, said quietly that the expression on his face was one she would remember for a long time. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Martin kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and the gathered congregation of Dusty Creek, who had taken a collective interest in this particular outcome, responded with an enthusiasm that rattled the window frames. Afterward there was a celebration at the Silver Spur, because Pete and Ruby Garland insisted, and Silas Reeves was there with his fiddle and the two guitar players, and a third man who had appeared from somewhere with a drum, and the dancing was substantial and sustained. Martin Monroe danced at his own wedding with a determination and a proficiency that bore no resemblance to the man who had been on the floor before the first song 3 months prior, and Effie danced with him and laughed at him and loved him and told him he was considerably better than he thought he was. "You have had a good teacher," he said. "I have had a student who paid attention," she said. Billy Prout danced so enthusiastically that he knocked over a chair, and nobody found it as funny as he did, except possibly Effie. The house on the summer range was ready by the time they returned to it that evening, the new roof tight over the west end, the main room floor replaced and smooth, the bookshelves Martin had built along the east wall waiting for their cargo. Effie had sent a trunk of books ahead with Clara's husband, and they were stacked in the bedroom waiting to be placed. There was a new stove in the lean-to kitchen, and a quilt on the bed that the widow Maddox had made as a wedding gift, squares of red and blue, and cream in a pattern the widow called Texas Star. They stood in the main room in the lamplight, surrounded by the quiet of the hill country night, and it was the same kind of quiet that Effie had found in Dusty Creek, but different here, more open, the night sounds of the ranch around them, a horse in the corral and an owl somewhere in the live oak outside the south window. "Home," Effie said, trying the word. Martin put his arm around her and said, "Home." And it was the same word, and it meant something larger and more settled than either of them had quite said before. The first year of their marriage was what the first year of most things is, a period of learning and adjustment and the occasional sharp corner. But the foundation was sound, and they were both people who could say what they meant and hear what was said to them. And this solved a great many of the problems before they could become the kind that leave marks. Effie continued to teach school. Riding the 4 miles to town on the roan mare Martin had persuaded Caldwell to let her purchase, arriving at Cedar Street before 8 every morning and returning in the late afternoon. The children accepted her marriage with the equanimity of children who have decided their teacher is a fixture and see no reason why her domestic arrangements should affect the spelling lessons. Pearl Davenport, the 11-year-old reader, came to Effie with a question in October. Was there a way to take the examination for the county teaching certificate before the usual age? She had been reading ahead in every subject and wanted to know how far ahead there was to go. Effie wrote 3 letters in Pearl's behalf, to the county superintendent and to 2 colleagues in San Antonio, and she spent extra hours with Pearl on the subjects the examination would cover. And she was not at all surprised when Pearl passed the examination the following spring at the age of 12, the youngest to have done so in the county's record. Martin had the complex and demanding work of managing the Rocking M's summer operation, which was not just cattle but the maintenance of range and fences and water sources, and the management of the hands who worked under him. A responsibility he took seriously and performed with the same particular combination of careful attention and decisive action that characterized everything he did. Caldwell came up from Uvalde in May and in October, spent a week inspecting operations and left satisfied, which was the highest praise that Caldwell was in the habit of dispensing. In the evenings, Martin came home. This was the thing that Effie turned over in her mind many times that first year, the particular pleasure of it, the sound of his horse in the corral, and then his boots on the porch, and then the door opening and him there, smelling of cattle and sun and cedar, and the way he always took his hat off in the doorway and hung it on the hook she had put there for exactly that purpose, and the way the room changed when he came into it. She had not known it would feel like this. She had thought she understood what love was, in the way that people think they understand things they have read about extensively. She had not known it would be so present, so constant, so tied up in the ordinary fabric of daily life, so much a matter of the particular way a man sits in a chair, and the way he holds his coffee cup, and the way he says her name when he comes through the door. She told him some version of this one evening in December, when the weather had gone cold and they were sitting by the fireplace after supper, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet when he was thinking about what to say rather than filling the silence with sound. "I did not know what I was looking for," he said finally, "when I was moving around all those years. I would not have told you that at the time because I did not know it either, but when I think about why I never went back to Louisiana, why I never settled anywhere that I could have settled, I think I was looking for something that I would not have known how to name." "And," she said. He looked at her across the fireplace, the light of it on his face, steady and warm. "I found it," he said simply, and she believed him without question because he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and this was one of the things she loved most about him. The winter was cold but manageable. The stone house held its heat well, and Effie's mother sent a second quilt from Charleston, along with a long letter full of advice about housekeeping in cold climates that was partly useful and partly inapplicable to Texas, and Effie appreciated every word of it. She wrote back in long letters of her own, describing the ranch and the country and the school and Martin, and her mother wrote back with increasing warmth about a man she had not yet met, because what Effie described could not be read by a woman who knew her daughter without recognition that this was something real and good. In March of 1883, Effie realized she was expecting a child. She told Martin on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch in the first good weather of the new spring, the oak tree showing its first small leaves. She told him simply and directly because that was how she did things, and he was very still for a moment, and then he reached across the small porch table and took her hand, and she could feel in his hand something that was not quite manageable, the weight of it. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Yes," he said honestly, which was the right answer. "Good," she said. "So am I think that is appropriate." He laughed, and she laughed, and the spring evening around them was gentle and full of possibility. The months of her pregnancy moved through spring and summer, and into autumn with the beautiful, heavy pace of a time that feels both very long and very short. She taught school until August, when Clara and the widow Maddox and 3 other women of the town collectively insisted that she rest. And she rested with some difficulty, because she was not by nature a person who was comfortable doing nothing. But she read a great many books, and she wrote long letters, and she had long conversations with Martin in the evenings about things they had never quite gotten around to before, their childhoods and their fears and their ideas about the future. He told her about growing up in Baton Rouge, the son of a carpenter who had died of fever when Martin was 14, leaving his wife with 3 children and very little else. His mother had kept them fed by taking in laundry and by the stubborn force of her will, and Martin had left at 16 not because he did not love her, but because he was one less mouth to feed, and he was old enough to make his own way. He had sent money back when he had it, which in the beginning was not often, and he had written letters that were never as long or as frequent as they should have been, and his mother had died in 1878 of a stroke that he had not been present for because he was 3 states away, and by the time the letter reached him, there was nothing to come back for. He had never told anyone this before. He said so, looking at the fire, and she kept hold of his hand and did not say anything immediately because she understood that some things want to be put down in silence rather than picked up by words right away. Eventually she said, "She would be glad of this. I believe that absolutely." He looked at her. "How can you know that?" "Because you are a good man," she said, "and good men come from somewhere, and that somewhere was her." He did not say anything, but his hand tightened on hers, and that was its own kind of answer. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a night when the north wind was coming down off the ridge, and the oak tree was rattling its last dry leaves against the south window. Clara Hutchins came to attend the birth along with the town's doctor, a capable and unsentimental man named Dr. Pratt, who had delivered a considerable number of Dusty Creek citizens under a variety of circumstances, and who pronounced everything to be proceeding normally with the confident cheerfulness of someone who has learned that calm is the most useful thing a doctor can bring to a room. Martin was in the main room. This was the custom, and he understood it, but it was the longest night he had ever spent, longer than any night on the range in hard weather, because all the skill and endurance he had learned over 14 years in the saddle were entirely inapplicable to this situation, and he could do nothing except sit in the chair by the cold fireplace with his hat in his hands and wait. When Dr. Pratt came to the door and said, "Healthy boy, Mr. Monroe, and your wife is well," Martin stood up and had to stand still for a moment before he could walk. Clara came out with the baby, a wrapped bundle of considerable complaint, and handed him over with the practiced ease of a woman who has handled newborns before, and Martin Monroe, who was not demonstrative and had never been, held his son for the first time and looked at him, and Clara discreetly went back into the bedroom and gave him the moment. They named him Thomas, after Martin's father. They called him Tom almost immediately, because he was definitively a Tom from the first week, a solid and determined baby who approached the business of being alive with what Effie described as vigorous intention and Martin described as stubbornness. Effie was back at school by January, because the town needed its teacher and because she needed the work, and Martin's mother in Dusty Creek, which was what he called the widow Maddox because it was what she had become, took Tom 3 days a week with a proprietary delight that satisfied everyone. The years moved on as years do in a place that is being built, each one adding something to what was there before, each one presenting its challenges and its gifts in roughly equal measure. Dusty Creek grew, not rapidly but steadily, the kind of growth that comes when a place has water and decent land and enough people who have decided to stay. The railroad spur that had been promised for years finally materialized in 1885, a small depot on the east side of town that connected to the main Texas and Pacific line, and the arrival of rail meant that the cattle operation changed, and the town changed with it. Martin's role at the Rocking M evolved with those changes. Caldwell, who was aging and finding the operation more demanding than he had expected, came to Martin in the spring of 1886 with a proposal. He was willing to sell the Summer Range property, the land and the cattle on it, on terms that would allow Martin to pay him over several years from the operation's profits. The price was fair, Caldwell being, as he had always been, fair without being warm. Martin came home that evening and sat down at the supper table and told Effie about the conversation, laying out the terms and the figures with his usual precision, and 2-year-old Tom ate his supper with focused indifference to the financial dimensions of the discussion. Effie listened to all of it. She looked at the figures he had written out on the paper he had brought home. She looked at the room around her, the bookshelves full of books, the stone walls, the south window with the oak tree visible through the glass. She looked at her husband. "Do you want this?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Then we should do it," she said. "It is a significant risk," he said. "Martin," she said, "you have not taken a significant risk since you asked me to dance, and that worked out reasonably well." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been cataloging and treasuring for nearly 4 years now, the one that was only for her, that did not look like anything else his face was capable of. "Reasonably well," he repeated. "Exceptionally well," she corrected. They signed the papers in June of 1886, and Martin Monroe, who had come to Dusty Creek 3 years and change ago with his wages and his horse and his saddle, became a rancher. The Rocking M Summer Range was renamed, as far as the family was concerned, because the brand had to stay for the cattle, but they called the land itself the Monroe Place, and the stone house became something larger than it had been, extended over the following 2 years with another room and a proper separate kitchen, and a covered porch that ran along the south side where the oak tree spread, and the mornings were good. Effie taught school for another 4 years, until 1887, when the town had grown enough to warrant a second teacher, and she was able to step back and take a more selective role, teaching older students 3 days a week, while a young woman named Miss Hartley handled the younger children full-time. Pearl Davenport, by this point, was 16 and had already passed 2 more county examinations, and was being looked at seriously by a normal school in San Antonio as a prospective student. Effie had written 6 letters on her behalf and intended to write 6 more. In the spring of 1887, Effie discovered she was expecting again. She told Martin in the same way she had told him the first time, sitting on the porch in the first good weather, the oak tree leafing out in the particular green that it had every April that felt newer and more surprising than seemed possible for a tree that old. "Are you afraid?" he asked her, echoing her own question from 4 years prior. "A little," she said. "Less than last time." "Good," he said. "I am less afraid, too." He took her hand. "I think that is appropriate." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and the April morning was warm and full of birds. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose, after Clara Hutchins, and after no one in particular on account of the rose, arrived in October of 1887 in better weather, and with somewhat less drama than her brother, which Dr. Pratt attributed to experience, and which Effie attributed to Clara Rose's early exhibition of a cooperative nature that distinguished her from her brother in almost every particular. Tom, who was almost 4, inspected his sister with the suspicious gravity of a child who has not quite decided what to make of a significant change to his domestic arrangements, and then announced that she was small, which was accurate, and that he supposed she could stay, which was generous of him, and then went out to see the horses. Martin held Clara Rose with the ease of a man who had done this before, and there was something in his face watching her that Effie thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The same face as when he had held Tom, but different too, because the second time a man holds his child he knows what it is, and that knowledge gives it a different weight. "Hello," he said to Clara Rose, who was asleep and offered no response. "I am your father. I should tell you right away that your mother is the best person I know and you have a great deal to learn from her." Effie, from the bed, said, "Martin." "It is true," he said, not looking away from the baby. Clara grew up alongside Tom in the stone house under the oak tree, and they grew up knowing the smell of cattle and cedar, and the particular quiet of the hill country night, and the particular noise of a household that had books and music in it, because their mother made sure of both. Effie had acquired a small organ in 1886, hauled up from San Antonio on the back of a wagon, and it sat in the main room, and she played it on Sunday mornings, and whenever anyone needed comforting, which in a household with 2 young children was with some regularity. Martin learned to tolerate the organ with affection. He did not play it himself, but he had, over the course of their marriage, developed a private opinion that his wife's playing on Sunday mornings was one of the better parts of his week, though he did not say this in so many words. He showed it instead by coming to lean in the doorway of the main room while she played, coffee in hand, and listening with the particular quality of attention that she had learned to recognize as his equivalent of saying something out loud. She always knew he was there, and she always played a little longer for it. Clara Hutchins and her husband remained their closest friends through all these years, the friendship becoming one of those bedrock things that outlasts the original proximity that created it, and becomes its own reason for continuing. Clara had 2 children of her own by this point, and the Hutchins and Monroe children grew up in and out of each other's households with the easy familiarity of children who have been introduced to each other's parents before they had opinions about the matter. Billy Prout, who had never entirely gotten over his role in the story, married a woman from a sheep ranch north of town in 1885, and settled close enough that he remained a fixture in the social life of Dusty Creek. He told the story of Martin Monroe's fall at the Silver Spur at every appropriate occasion, and at several inappropriate ones, and the story acquired with each telling the embellishments that stories acquire in the hands of an enthusiastic narrator, so that by 1888 the fall had become considerably more dramatic, and the immediate aftermath more romantic than Effie remembered it. "You are exaggerating," she told Billy once, at a dinner party at the Hutchins house. "I am being cinematic," Billy said with great dignity. "He is correct that you were on the floor," Effie told Martin. "I was on the floor," Martin agreed. "Before the first song ended," Billy added unnecessarily. "Before the first song ended," Martin confirmed, "and I have been grateful for it ever since." This was such an unusually romantic statement for Martin Monroe to make in company that the table went briefly quiet, and then Clara Hutchins began to clap, which was the only appropriate response. The year 1889 brought with it a dry summer that put stress on the range and on the water sources, and Martin spent a considerable part of that summer managing the herd across the broader range to distribute pressure on the grass, and ensuring the stock tanks were maintained and deepened where possible. It was hard work and long hours, and Effie, who understood the ranch's operation as well as she understood her classroom by this point, managed the household and the books and the 2 children with the same steady competence she brought to everything. There were days that summer that were genuinely hard, when the heat was relentless and the worry about the herd was present and real, and the children were restless and the well was lower than usual, and Effie had the particular experience of a woman who has built something real and knows that real things are subject to real losses. She did not panic. She made sure everyone ate and the children slept and the books were kept accurately. Martin came in one evening in August and sat at the table and looked at her with the weariness of a man who had been fighting the land all day. And she put supper on the table and sat across from him and said, "Tell me where we are." He told her. The numbers were tight but manageable if the drought broke by September. "It will break," she said. "You do not know that," he said. "I know that everything I care about is in this house and on this land and next to me at this table," she said, "and that we have managed everything that has come at us so far. I have every reason to expect we will manage this." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I love you, Effie." He did not say it often, not because he did not feel it, but because he was not a man who deployed large words casually. And she had come to understand that this meant when he said them, they were carrying the full weight of all the times he had not said them. "I know," she said. "I love you too." The rain came in the second week of September, 3 days of steady, soaking, hill country rain that refilled the stock tanks and greened the grass, and did not solve every problem but solved enough of them. Martin stood on the porch in the rain for a while and Effie stood next to him, and they watched it fall on the live oak and the pasture and the limestone ridge in the distance. And Tom came and stood between them and held both their hands. And Clara Rose, who was 2, pressed her face against the south window from inside and watched the water with absolute delight. The years between 1889 and 1892 were the years of building in the more settled sense, the years when the ranch became established enough that Martin could begin planning the future of it rather than only managing the present. He hired 2 hands permanently and brought on a third for the busy season, and the operation achieved a stability that allowed him to think in terms of years rather than months. Effie had, by this point, shifted her teaching entirely to the older students, and to a small but genuine tutoring program she had established in conjunction with the church, Saturday mornings for any child who wanted additional instruction in reading and mathematics. It was entirely voluntary and entirely informal, and it was attended, year after year, by between 6 and 12 children who would otherwise not have had access to the instruction. Pearl Davenport, who had gone to the normal school in San Antonio and returned to Dusty Creek as a qualified teacher herself, took over the afternoon sessions in 1891, and the arrangement became something that lasted for many years beyond both their direct involvement. In 1892, Effie's mother, Margaret Lockhart, came to Texas. She had been talking about it in letters for 2 years, and Effie had been inviting her for 3. And the barrier had been partly the distance, and partly the expense, and partly the formidable inertia of a woman who has lived in the same place for 50 years, and finds the idea of leaving it abstractly more manageable than the reality. But Margaret Lockhart was 61 years old, and her daughter and grandchildren were in Texas, and she was, at the end of the accounting, a woman who had decided to keep living, and living was where the people you loved were. She arrived on the train at the Dusty Creek Depot on a Tuesday afternoon in April, a small, upright woman in a dark traveling suit with Effie's green eyes and a quality of alert observation that she had passed on to her daughter in good measure. Effie was at the depot, and the 2 women embraced with the particular force of people who have been separated by a continent and years of correspondence, and are now in the same physical space for the first time in nearly a decade. Martin was there too, with Tom and Clara Rose, and he met his mother-in-law for the first time with the slight formality of a man who is aware that this is an important introduction and wants to do it properly. Margaret Lockhart looked at him for a moment with those green eyes, the same careful assessment Effie had given him the night he got off the floor. "You are Martin," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My daughter has written me a great deal about you," she said. "She has written a great deal about you as well, ma'am," he said. Margaret Lockhart smiled then, the same smile Effie had, the one that changed the whole face. "Well then," she said, "we should not find each other too surprising." She stayed 3 months, which extended to 6, which ended with the arrangement that she would spend winters in Charleston, because She was not built for Texas winters and summers in Dusty Creek, because she was not willing to be away from the grandchildren for longer than that. It was an arrangement that suited everyone admirably and continued for 12 years until her death in 1904, by which time she had become, quietly and completely, a fixture of the Monroe household and of Dusty Creek itself, known to every child Effie had ever taught as Mrs. Lockhart with the books and the green eyes who told the best stories. Tom Monroe grew up into the ranch with the natural ease of a boy who has grown up around cattle and land, and has absorbed both without being required to make a decision about them. By the time he was 12, he was a genuinely useful hand, and by 15, he was managing sections of the operation that Martin assigned to him with full confidence. He had his father's directness and his mother's capacity for paying attention, which was a combination that served him well. Clara Rose grew up with her mother's green eyes and her father's quality of stillness, and a musical gift that she had from neither of them in any obvious way. The organ lessons Effie had given her revealing almost immediately that she was playing beyond instruction. She was also, by the age of 10, the best reader in whatever room she was in, which caused Effie a satisfaction she did not try to disguise. Martin Monroe, in the summer of 1895, stood on the ridge above the Monroe place, the same ridge where he had asked Effie to make a life with him 13 years prior, and looked at the country below him. The ranch was visible from here, the stone house and the covered porch and the live oak, and further out the pastures and the stock tanks and the small figures of his hands moving with the herd. It was a clear July morning, and the sky was doing what the Texas hill country sky does in July, being enormous and blazing and absolutely indifferent to anything below it. And below it was everything he had built and everything he had been given and everything he had not known to want. He heard the horse before he saw it, the familiar sound of Effie's roan mare, old now but still steady, coming up the cattle track, and then she was at the top of the ridge beside him, hat pushed back on her head, 40 years old this year, and he thought as beautiful as she had ever been in the way that people become more beautiful when you know them completely. "Tom said you came up here," she said, dismounting. "I wanted to look at it," he said. She came to stand beside him and look at it too. "I was thinking," he said, "about that Saturday night at the Silver Spur." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "About being on the floor. About what came after," he said. "About getting up." He turned to look at her. "I have spent a good deal of time since then being grateful for floors that are more slippery than they should be." Effie Lockhart Monroe looked at her husband in the July light, the man with the dark eyes and the careful attention and the square jaw that was a little more lined now and no less honest, and she thought about all the things that had happened between that Saturday night and this ridge. The dancing and the walking home and the Sunday afternoons and the wildflowers and the fossil and the limestone and the Book of Whitman and the widow Maddox's debt and the proposal on this same ridge and the blue dress and the wedding and Tom's birth and Clara Rose and the drought and the ranch and 13 years of evenings and mornings and ordinary days that were, in aggregate, the most extraordinary thing she had ever been part of. "So am I," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and the view below them was everything they had made, and the hawk was there, or perhaps a different hawk, turning the same slow circles over the cedar, and the sky was as big as it had always been. Down at the ranch house, Tom was working the corral and Clara Rose was playing the organ, the notes of it drifting up to the ridge on the summer air, light and clear and surprisingly far-carrying in the way that music is when the day is still. Martin listened to it. He was smiling, which he did more than he had used to, and the smile was the same one that had started on the floor of the Silver Spur on a spring night in 1882 and had not in any essential way stopped since. "She plays better than you," he said. "She has always played better than me," Effie said with absolute equanimity. "You taught her." "I showed her where the keys were," Effie said. "Everything after that was hers." They stayed on the ridge until the music stopped and Tom rode out of the corral, and the morning settled into its midday wait, and then they rode back down together, side by side on the cattle track, through the cedar, and down to the house that was home and the life they had made of all the ordinary and extraordinary days that had been given to them. The years after that were full and good. Clara Rose's musical ability became known beyond Dusty Creek when she was 17, and the organist at the Methodist Church in San Antonio wrote to Effie asking if the girl might consider studies. And Clara Rose considered, and went, and came home again to Dusty Creek, because home was where she was from, and she had decided to be from somewhere in particular. She gave lessons out of the stone house to a generation of hill country children, and she played at the church, and she married a veterinarian named Cowboy who settled his practice in Dusty Creek in 1910, and they had 3 children, and the house on the ranch was busy and full, and exactly what a house should be. Tom Monroe married in 1906, a rancher's daughter from Careville named Anna, a tall and practical young woman who looked at the rocking summer range with the eye of someone who had grown up around land and knew good land when she saw it, and intended to help build on it. She and Effie liked each other immediately, which Martin said was the best possible outcome, and Tom said was simply obvious, and Anna came into the household with the ease of someone who fits in because she is genuinely what she is. Tom and Anna's first child, a boy named Thomas James Monroe, arrived in 1908. He was born in the stone house under the live oak, which was taller than it had ever been, and his grandmother Effie held him and said, "Hello, Thomas," and thought about all the hellos that had been said in this house, and all the ones that were yet to come. Martin Monroe lived to be 74 years old. He ranched until he was 68. Working the land with the same steady attention that had characterized everything he did. And when he finally handed the operation over to Tom, he did it with the quiet completeness of a man who is not leaving, but simply giving what he has built to the next person who will care for it. In his last years, he sat on the south porch under the oak tree and watched the ranch from there, and read the books that Effie brought him. And in the evenings when Clara Rose came to play the organ, he listened from the porch with his coffee, and the particular expression that was only for things he valued very much. He died in the spring of 1921, on a morning when the hill country was coming into bloom after a good wet winter, the cedar and the limestone and the wildflowers all doing what they did when the conditions were right, which was to be entirely and abundantly themselves. Effie was with him. She held his hand. She said what she needed to say, and he said what he needed to say, and the last thing he said was her name, plainly, the same way he had always said it, without ornament, just the word and the meaning behind it. She buried him on the ridge above the ranch, the place where they had looked at the country together and where he had proposed, and where they had stood in the July heat of 1895 and counted their blessings. The whole of Dusty Creek came, which was by 1921 considerably more people than it had been in 1882, and many of them were people whose parents and grandparents had been there the night Martin Monroe landed on the floor of the Silver Spur before the first song ended. Effie Lockhart Monroe lived another 12 years after that, bright and sharp until the last, teaching and reading and corresponding and playing the organ on Sunday mornings, and being present, fully and completely present, in the way she had always been. She died in 1933 at the age of 75, in the stone house under the live oak, with Tom and Anna and Clara Rose and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren around her, and the south porch visible through the window, and the country beyond it that she had come to as a young woman with 2 trunks of books, and had never for a single day regretted. In her papers after, they found a letter she had been writing to her daughter Clara Rose and had not quite finished. It was dated 2 days before she died, and it was mostly about practical matters, the distribution of the books and the tortoiseshell combs and the Texas star quilt that was still on the bed after 50 years. But at the bottom she had written, in her precise schoolteacher's hand, I want you to know that it has been a very good life. Better than I planned for and exactly what I needed. If you are ever in a situation where a man is on the floor and in need of a hand up, give him your hand without hesitation. You do not always know, at the moment of a small kindness, what it is the beginning of. Clara Rose read this aloud on the porch under the oak tree, and Tom was there, and Anna, and the children of both families, and the hill country evening was doing what it always did, putting on its show of light and distance and enormous sky, and no one said anything for a while because some things want to be received in silence first. Then Tom, who was 57 years old and had his father's face and his mother's green eyes and both their stubbornness in good measure, stood up and looked at the ridge where his father was buried and said, "I would like to have a dance." And so they did. They moved the chairs off the south porch into the yard, and Clara Rose played the organ through the window, and they danced on the porch boards in the evening light, the whole family together, and the live oak spread its arms over all of them, and the Texas sky went from gold to rose to the deep indigo that comes just before the first star appears. And when the first star appeared, it was as it had always been above the Monroe place, brilliant and close and impossible to get used to, and no one tried.